Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Richard Beach. It's nice to see returning GCLR participants, and we welcome those of you joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue to return to future presentations. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, Jihei Shin, Cindy Fujimoto, and members of the GCLR research team.
Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the field of literacy and language arts. GCLR currently seeks volunteers for a study on the nature of technology-mediated interactions within literacy-focused web seminars. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. Also, we invite all participants to take our GCLR survey. The hyperlink is on our website. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Beach will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you're participating in tonight's web seminar. Please use the star tool and click your location on the map. Thank you so much. Dr. Richard Beach is an internationally recognized scholar and speaker who has presented widely in the areas of reader response, particularly multicultural literature, digital writing, and use of literacy tools and critical inquiry. He's also a professor emeritus in English education at the University of Minnesota, USA. Dr. Beach is the author of over 20 books. His latest book, Understanding and Creating Digital Text, will be released next week on October 15th. Dr. Beach's web seminar will focus how affordances of digital tools, multimodality, collaboration, interactivity, intertextuality, recontextualization, and identity constructions serve to foster critical literacy. Dr. Beach will discuss how uses of digital tools are transforming instruction through supporting experiential and connected learning, as well as alternative learning spaces. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Beach and his presentation entitled, How Affordances of Digital Tool Use Foster Critical Literacy. Let's all give Dr. Beach a virtual round of applause using one of the emoticon symbols found in the drop box just below the moderator name.
Good evening, everybody. So glad you could join this wonderful seminar. I'm honored to be here. As I said, tonight I'm going to be talking about the topic of how affordances of digital tools are used to foster critical literacy. And it was indicated I have a handout on Google Docs at the URL indicated below. We've also put it in the chat room. That handout has a lot of links to resources, related readings, some apps that are relevant to these different tools, and I won't be talking a lot about specific apps, but there's a ton of them on there for your use. If you want to create a Word document off of the Google Docs, you can simply just download it off of Docs as a Word document. So tonight I'm going to be talking about critical literacy and critical inquiry, and I'm drawing on 4 different frameworks that I've found really useful. A lot of these are fairly recent. The first one is a new book by Mitzi Lewison, Chris Leland, and Jerry Harsty. And Jerry, I'm glad to see you're in the chat room, called Creating Critical Classrooms, Reading and Writing with an Edge. This is a wonderful book that has a lot of very specific classroom examples of teachers engaging in critical inquiry. And the focus of this book has a lot to do with what's on this chart, where teachers and students draw on their own personal and cultural resources. They then apply those in terms of using different critical practices. And to me, a key concept here is the whole idea of a critical stance. Because I think learning to adopt a critical stance is very important in terms of a critical literacy approach. Having that stance leads to then students learning to disrupt the commonplace. They challenge the commonplace. Why are we having this? What's going on here in the status quo? They're learning to interrogate different multiple perspectives. They're focusing on the social-political issues of power, injustice, privilege that are central to critical inquiry. And they're taking action to promote social justice. And it's that taking action which is, I think, a really important part of how digital tools can really foster critical literacy. The second framework I'm drawing on is a book by Becky Rogers, Melissa Mosley, and Marion Kramer, and the Literacy for Social Justice Teacher Research Group in St. Louis, called Designing Socially Just Learning Communities. And this is a wonderful book, too, related to on-the-ground action in terms of fostering a focus on equity, access, and outcomes. And in that book, as illustrated in this chart, you see a focus on action, advocacy, social change, building community, critical inquiry analysis, and again, developing critical stances. So taking the stance becomes another important part of critical inquiry. The third framework I'm drawing on is Hillary Jenks, who actually presented last year on this seminar, her new book called Doing Critical Literacy, Texts and Activities for Students and Teachers. And this is a very practical book with tons of specific activities, very multimodal in terms of not only how the book is presented in terms of ideas, but a focus on multimodality and media critical analysis. So I highly recommend this book also. And Jenks really, as the others do, focuses on making connections between what's going on in students' lives and in the world, how students need to learn how to find out information to interrogate issues in the world, exploring the problematic, how is the problematic portrayed in texts and practices, wondering who benefits from certain practices, who's disadvantaged by these practices, and then imagining possibilities for making a positive difference, again, in terms of a focus on change. The fourth framework that I draw on is a focus on what's called critical engagement. The critical engagement framework, as represented in the articles listed here by Cynthia Lewis, Tierney, Karen Woolward, and others, really focuses on the emotions, how the emotions of anger, frustration, confusion, concern, outrage really triggers a critical stance and leads to identification of problems. So if people are upset or angry, how can we tap into that anger, being upset, to lead them to adopt a critical stance? So the key question is, given these different frameworks of critical inquiry, how do we think about these in terms of a focus on digital literacies? And to some degree, our curriculums in schools are still very much focused on a print literacy, but I think that has rapidly changed in the last 3 or 4 years to a focus more on digital literacy and the literacies of being networked, of being linked, of sharing, of commenting, bookmarking. These digital literacies have become more and more prevalent. So as researchers, we're wondering how can we think about how uses of these digital literacies can foster critical inquiry. Now, I think these literacies also, digital literacies, can really help teachers, and we're seeing results. So, for example, a Pew Research study finding that teachers perceive use of digital technologies in ways that enhance and improve students' writing. Half the teachers indicated it certainly made things easier and really had a positive effect on teaching writing. So I'm going to be talking tonight about how we can think about doing this research in terms of affordances. And by affordances, I mean, what do the digital tools that we use, how do they foster certain kinds of affordances? And by affordances, I also mean, how does a tool can be used in an activity to generate certain critical literacy practices? You could think of a hammer, for example, as a tool that has certain affordances. I could use a hammer to drive in a nail, but I could also use it to knock one of you over the head. And that's a very different affordance. The affordances I'm going to be talking about tonight are multimodality, interactivity, collaboration, intertextuality and recontextualization, and identity construction. Now, these affordances are not necessarily in the tool themselves. The affordances are in the activity that teachers create. So it's really important as researchers to be looking at the unit of analysis as the activity that is mediated by the use of a digital tool that leads to these different affordances. So given these affordances, how can we then look at how they foster critical inquiry? For example, how they foster adopting a critical stance to identify certain problems or issues, or generating alternative perspectives and looking at an issue or problem, or generating solutions or fostering action. So the first one, multimodality. Now, multimodality has been around for a while. It's nothing new, but it is the whole notion of how different kinds of text, in this case images, intersect with other kinds of text or tools, in this case print. Now, multimodality, we see a lot of examples in terms of use of digital images or video tools. And these images or videos can be used to portray problems or issues in very powerful ways. And in doing so, they evoke certain emotions that lead to posing these how come questions that are central to adopting a critical stance. They also can be used to target certain groups, to engage in civic engagement, to take on and challenge the status quo. One example of this is a project in Los Angeles called the Out the Window Project, and young people created videos that were then placed on 7 million Los Angeles bus riders. So the bus riders would be on the buses. They'd be viewing these videos about issues in their local neighborhood. And so what's interesting about this project is how digital video portrays issues in a particular area or context that would then engage the bus riders to say, hey, I didn't know what was going on in my neighborhood. I'm going to do something about this. So it's an example of digital video leading to critical stances that then they lead to generating actions. So tonight I'm going to talk a lot about a focus on climate change. And the question is, how do we think about how to use digital tools to motivate people's interest in this serious problem? And the problem is, over the last 30 years, there's been a marked increase in CO2 emissions over the 350 mark, which is sort of a mark where it's like, yeah, this is not good. And you see on this chart, as temperatures are rising, the CO2 is also rising. So this is an example just of a chart, but it is visually powerful in terms of portraying the issue of increased global climate change. So, for example, in 1982, you see on the left side the Arctic melting that has occurred since then, to the right side, where now it's a huge difference due to this global increase in temperature change. And that has led to questions of how do we portray this. Now, we can turn out reports, and there have been many reports in the last year about climate change. I would argue that it's really the use of images and video that can really bring home this issue to people. So here we have South Beach in Miami today. And Miami is one of the cities that is probably most vulnerable in terms of rising sea change levels. And here is South Beach, Miami, with a 12-foot sea rise. This may occur in fewer than 20 years. Here we have the Jefferson Memorial, as it is today. And here we have the Jefferson Memorial, 25-foot sea rise. This could occur in 30 years. So these are very powerful images that I think could be used to foster a focus on this issue or problem. So these images, I think, are part of what Naomi Klein, in a wonderful new book, calls This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, where she notes that either we embrace radical change ourselves or radical change will be visited upon our physical world. The status quo is no longer an option. So there's a need to motivate action related to reversing CO2 emissions in the next 30 years. And I would say it's a critical time for change and time to be critical. The issue as researchers, though, is how do we get people to think about these issues? Because the systems that shape these different issues, and I've written about this in a forthcoming commentary in the Journal of Adolescent Adult Literacy, is the systems are invisible. The system of economic and political power is invisible. Often even climate change itself is invisible to people. And so how do we get people to think about these systems in ways of fostering their emotions that will lead to critique and then lead to change? And I would argue that this could be done through images and videos, but also through fiction and in drama, as we'll talk about a little later. So this, though, is the big challenge when we think of weather as a daily matter. Today in Minnesota, it was beautiful, and I would say, oh, no problem, weather is beautiful. But climate is different from weather, and climate is an invisible phenomenon, and the question is, how do we, again, motivate people to see it as an issue or problem through the use of the powerful digital tools of images and video. Another example of the invisibility of this is when you look at political ads in the current race for the Senate and House. Of the different groups giving money for political ads, many of these groups do not need to disclose who they are in terms of their donations. And one of these groups, Americans for Prosperity, is increased by 4 or 5 times from 2012 to 2014, their donations. They're one of the leading groups, and that is the Koch brothers, and a lot of that has to do with challenging attempts to increase use of solar and wind power, as well as any kind of regulation of CO2 emissions, i.e. the coal industry is striking back. So this is a real issue in terms of invisible forces, and how do we foster critical inquiry when the forces are invisible. Students can certainly themselves use a lot of these. This is an example of an infographic that a student at the Perkins School of the Arts here in Minnesota created, having to do with obesity. And what's important about infographics is that it takes a lot of images and then presents an issue through the use of images, as in this infographic. Another example has to do with death row convictions and DNA evidence, where in this infographic, many of them, were confessed, pled guilty, but then they were exonerated with DNA evidence. Another example is the use of graphic novels or comic books. In this case, this is Comic Life, which is a very powerful comic digital tool for creating comics. And in this case, a student who was a Muslim student in a high school here in Minnesota talks about her experience of being raised as in a conservative Muslim family, and thought she had a lot of friends and support. And then later on, with the 9/11 attacks, a lot of her friends started to challenge her and challenge the whole notion of what does Islam mean, and is it terrorism? And so in this use of a multimodal Comic Life comic, she's able to mesh the images with the language. And I think that multimodality here works really well to convey her concerns about these issues of being labeled a terrorist, even though she was simply a Muslim high school student. Another affordance has to do with interactivity. And interactivity has to do with how the digital tools foster connections and interactivity online in ways that will lead to critical inquiry. So we've certainly seen a lot of examples of interactivity through these viral videos, like the Gangnam video here, where it had a lot of spreadability, say about a year ago. But these are very powerful in terms of how people send out messages. And Dana Boyd has identified certain of the affordances associated with interactivity. She notes that one affordance is persistence, that these interactions are recorded and archived so we can access them. They're replicable. We can easily copy and transform them, so we can remix them and send them out in other forms. They're highly scalable. They're easy to disseminate. Henry Jenkins has a wonderful other new book called Spreadability, where he talks about how content can go easily viral because it's spreadable. And that's part of a sort of attention transacting context or culture, where we send out stuff and they're easily spreadable. And then searchability, people can locate this stuff and they can locate other people and they can make connections. So I'm going to pause a little bit here and ask you, for this webinar, and we have 114 people on the webinar, could you just reflect on interactivity on this webinar in the chat box? How does use of this kind of a webinar foster interactivity? What do you gain from this participation in this and other activities, or in your own interactivity on Facebook and Twitter? So if you could just post in some comments, I'll pause a little bit here, take a little break, and talk about in the chat box, how, in the box in the very low right column, how does this use of a webinar like this foster your interactivity or spreadability? So transmission of ideas and different ways of thinking, multiple perspectives. Yes, drawing on past experiences. transcending the local. And this is a transnational and international context here. Intertextuality, you're making connections. You're learning from experts. So connectivity across the country and the world. Meeting with your colleagues. Certainly a lot of you are teaching online where you can interact outside the classroom, and that's become a huge example, as illustrated in the use of increased use of MOOCs. Replicability, the online discussions. The fact that this stuff is archived, you can go back and see previous presentations from this seminar. So it's a vast database of material that's being created here. Yeah, you're not alone. And this is critical for civic engagement and really fostering movements. Saw a wonderful movie last night called Pride, which is about gay supporting minors in the Thatcher era, and they were successful because they could work together. And this was a big issue because things were not going well for them. But through their interaction, through their working together, they became powerful in England. Yes, acquiring new tools. So lots of interesting postings here about this webinar. And I think it's this metacognitive reflection that's an important part of the research. So when you're doing research, one of the advantages of digital tools is you have an instant transcript, right? When you've got online discussion, you've got your transcript done. But I think we also need to go back and ask our participants, well, reflect on this post or reflect on that post so that you've got their perceptions of the value and then also the challenges, because there are real challenges here in terms of spreadability, what's being spread, who's spreading it, and so on. But having these online discussions as part of your research, I think, becomes a really powerful tool. So I'm going to move on here. Another important affordances is collaboration. And collaboration allows for different people with different perspectives to share those perspectives and see how those perspectives are different from their own. And this was a study by Julie Correa and Sarkazic when they were studying students talking about the downfall of the Mayan civilization online. And what was interesting about this was the students each brought very different ways of thinking or perspectives. One student was much more the thoughtful gatherer who was gathering a lot of information about this topic of the Mayan civilization, whereas another student was more the summarizer. She summarized the key points. But when these students interacted with each other, they gained from each other through their collaboration. They learned the importance of gathering specific information. And the student who was a gatherer learned the importance of reflecting and making larger inferences. So it's that sharing of competing different perspectives through collaboration that I think is critical to a critical inquiry approach, as we've talked about in terms of adopting different perspectives. Now, one of the other tools that's really helpful for collaboration is the use of DIGO sticky notes. And DIGO sticky notes is an annotation tool where students add little annotations, and you can see these little sticky notes on this article about energy and power related to climate change. And they added their sticky notes. Here's another example of a discussion. So you can actually, it can be a form of a discussion where they're talking about the Mauleo Observatory, where they actually measure CO2 emissions. It's a great place to do that. And so you see them sharing their sticky note annotations as a discussion, and they're raising questions of each other. And what's interesting here is this is a very multimodal interaction, because what happens is when the students see these sticky notes, they say, ooh, I wonder what's under that sticky note. And that's a very multimodal move, where it's that image of the yellow sticky notes and they want to unpack those sticky notes. But they're also challenging each other in terms of their critical inquiry approach. So, for example, in response to an article about wind turbines in California, one student asked the question, why are they complaining about the turbines? It doesn't even look bad. And another student said, wait a minute, that's what you think. Have you ever actually been near a wind turbine or lived around one or close to one? So here you have some questioning, some pushback that's key to critical inquiry. So and here's another example of sharing these different annotations. So when we did an analysis of these annotations, we found that a third of them were engaged in questioning, which is, I thought, really important. These are sixth graders. They're questioning each other, and so they're engaged in critical inquiry, as well as making connections, a fifth of them, integrating and making connections, as well as evaluating the text. So we think the research on use of these kind of annotations does contribute to a critical inquiry orientation. What's also important is when they're drawing on the different texts that they're reading and drawing on these annotations, they're getting a wide range of different perspectives. So here's an example of a student's writing after they read these annotations. And what's interesting about this essay is that you see very different perspectives. I am perplexed in choosing if wind energy is a good source. Well, wind energy is a good source because it's renewable. Ooh, it can also cause irritation. So this student got these different perspectives from reading the competing annotations. Even though it doesn't cause any greenhouse gases in the air, wind turbines are harmful to wildlife and space. So again, back and forth, a kind of dialogic interaction evident through drawing on those annotations. So the annotations really fostered critical reading. They fostered exposure to different perspectives and different practices, all part of collaboration. Now, another interesting affordance of digital tools has to do with intertextuality or recontextualization. And a key theory behind the importance of this is the whole idea of connectivism. And connectivism, as articulated by Stephen Downes and others, is the idea that the knowledge is not in our heads, the knowledge is in the network. That knowledge is a network phenomenon. And so we know something by it being organized in a certain way in a network that exhibits patterns of connectivity. So to learn is to acquire patterns, to see connections. And this is true for both the community as it is for an individual. So, for example, there's been some interesting research, and this is analysis by Ed Finn, and a lot of this research is being conducted at the Stanford Literacy Lab, and I put a link to that lab in the handout. But that research looks at what's called distant reading. So in contrast to the focus on close reading, distant reading has to do with looking at the big picture of how people make connections across different texts. And in this analysis, Ed Finn analyzed reviews on Amazon of the book Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And he was looking at how do readers make connections between David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest and other texts. And what was really interesting here was the connection a lot of readers made between Infinite Jest and Hamlet. Infinite Jest draws from the Hamlet graveyard scene, but the readers also were seeing connections between the themes and characters in Infinite Jest and Hamlet, as well as Catch-22 and Gravities, and a range of different texts. So this intertextuality was very much part of their responses to the text of infinite jest. And I want to argue that this would be a great tool for studying students' intertextuality. That we have students reading a lot of books, but they often read these in isolation, where they should be reading them in terms of making connections between the books they're reading. So if we could conduct research about the intertextuality of their reading across years and years, and then see how they make connections, we could use tools like this to really understand the ways in which they build knowledge through their connections, because it's really their connections that becomes part of their knowledge. Another example is analysis of, these are the reviewers, professional reviewers. These are the kind of professional newspaper reviewers, and they made very different connections, much more in terms of David Foster Wallace's own writing and connections. But they were bringing a very different perspective in terms of how does his text, Infinite Jest, link to his other text. Now here's one for Toni Morrison, and you see the connections here that are made between Beloved and texts like Invisible Man or The Stranger or White Noise by Beloved. So here we have another example of this use of this interesting algorithm to analyze these textual connections. Now, wikis are one powerful tool, and I've included links to some wiki tools in the handout, which can be used to make connections. Because in creating a wiki, as an example of Wikipedia articles, there's a lot of connections going on in the activity itself of creating Wikipedia articles. So when people create these Wikipedia articles, they're drawing on their knowledge of a certain topic or issue, and then other people come on and pose questions about that, and they actually revise those Wikipedia articles. So a great activity for students is actually having them go on and revise a Wikipedia article, adding their own perspectives, and that might trigger a certain critical stance, that they might find an article as problematic and say, "Oh, what's going on here? How come we have this? I'm going to make some changes." Another example of use of wiki annotations is Teresa Dobson's work in use of a short story. This is a story by Alice Munro, where her students she took the story, put it into a wiki, and then the students added their own little mini stories. And so a student might take a phrase and then create a little story out of that phrase, and this creates this sort of hypertext story version of the original story. And this is an example of remix, of altering text in ways that engage readers as active contributors to making different connections. So this remix kind of example, or hypertext, it invites the readers to become active, engaged in critical inquiry. This text is not out there, its text is created through the use of digital tools. Now, another example of intertextuality occurs with the use of VoiceRead, and I would say VoiceRead is one of the most popular tools that teachers are using out there, because with VoiceRead you can have images, but then multiple people can comment and add their own annotations, audio or written, to those images. So here, back to climate change, students, this was students in a project we studied, they added their little comments about images related to climate change. And in this case, the doodle here shows the issue of the leaf and the sunlight. And we analyzed these annotations, but we found that most of them actually reflected, very interestingly, a very critical orientation of seeing causal relationships between images and issues of climate change. So a lot of causal thinking was going on through the use of these annotations. Now, a related tool, or Affordances, has to do with what's we call recontextualizing. And this is central to critical inquiry, where in recontextualizing, you're critiquing the text or image's original meaning, and you're creating a new alternative meaning through parody, through remix. So the text occurs across time through recontextualizing, and it's that recontextualizing mediated by the use of digital tools that leads to critique. For example, and here I'm drawing on Bloomhart's categories, here is an example of a remix of a McDonald's image where the remix involves decontextualizing the original context, recontextualizing, placing in a new context. So the original sort of rah-rah McDonald image is recontextualized in a new critical context of obesity, and particularly child obesity. And then contextualizing creates a new text. So through recontextualizing, students use digital tools to engage in critique. Now, here's an example from our climate change study. This is a voice thread image where the student took this image of a kind of macho Mustang, all-American power car, note the American flags on the license plate, took that image and recontextualized it in a critical way. This is a Mustang releasing combustion. So she was able to take this image and recontextualize it in a critical way to point to the ways our cars are creating emissions and combustions that are leading to climate change. The final affordance I want to talk about is identity construction. How do students use tools to construct their identities? And for researchers, one way of looking at how they construct online identities on Facebook, on Twitter, through constant sharing of their identities is discourse analysis, where you're looking at the discourses that they're taking up online to portray themselves, their identities. And they double voice these discourses. They may double voice the discourse of romance, of feminism, of business. And this is one way I think we can look at the ways in which they're creating these identities. I want to talk about our research where we looked at students creating identities in an online role play. And these students were in a high school where the websites that they had to access to write their papers were being blocked. And so they were not happy. So they're asking these how come critical questions. And on the online role play, they created different roles. They created persona. They took up different appeals, and they argued about this issue back and forth. And they did this on a Ning, which is, I think, a really useful platform for discussions. And note here the different avatars they took up. So this is an example of multimodality. And these affordances, by the way, interact a lot. Multimodality in terms of visual rhetoric. So you take up a certain avatar that represents your ethos, your persona, to argue your position. And the students also knew the different roles they were taking up. They could view this using a digital map, the different roles and the connections and relationships. Because what they were doing also was creating affiliations between their different roles. So this was the online role play over time, took place over a period of a week, and they went back and forth arguing their positions. And they were not happy. Again, this is an example of emotions, back to critical engagement. We can't get on the Nazi websites, but Mein Kampf is on display in the library. How come? I can understand that you can't go on websites, but we can read this book, and we can't go to a website that might have historical facts. So here's an example of visual rhetoric where this student, and she's not at all like this image, by the way. So we create these online images or identities that may be very different from our own lived world identities. This is emo girl. I think the internet uses policies are ridiculous. The policies are impossible to find. I spend half an hour trying to find them. I'm a young, computer-savvy person. So that's her kind of persona that she's created through the image. Now, the students in learning about this found that they could actually take the stuff they wrote it up in papers, they took that, they met with administration, and administration agreed to unblock the sites. So this was an example of action leading to change. But what was interesting was the students really gained from this, from exposure to different perspectives. And this is one student's comment. If this had been just a writing assignment, it would have been just one-sided. You can use persuasive arguments on paper, but you can't have a back and forth conversation on it. It helped me get into another person's shoes. I think like someone different from myself. So these students recognized how administrators might think about this and use that to really enhance their arguments. So to conclude, I think we have a great opportunity for research on this. How do we use these digital tools to foster critical inquiry? At the same time, I think we need to think about the whole challenge of what you might call technological boosterism, that we promote these tools and we think about, oh, they're going to engage our students, but are they really engaging them in critical inquiry? And that leads to the question of how can we use these different affordances to foster that critical inquiry? And how, particularly in terms of how technology itself is shaping society. So again, I have a lot of material, a lot of links on the handout on this Google Docs. It's also on the website, and I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Dr. Beach, thank you for your insightful and engaging presentation. We'll now invite Dr. Beach to respond to the questions that you have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type in your questions in this Q&A session facilitated by Dr. Arbers.
Thanks so much, Rick. That was a very amazing presentation, and it certainly elicited a large number of comments in the chat and a lot of questions. So I'm just going to start out with one question from one respondent or one participant who asked, Dr. Beach, how do we keep up? You have so many apps, your handout has a lot of different resources, but how do educators keep up?
Well, that leads to one way is our new book is coming out on Wednesday, and it has a lot of resources and examples of use of these tools for both not only creating digital text, but understanding text. And this is a whole other important area of research where we're studying how reading, and there was a front page article in the New York Times about young kids and reading and issues around reading ebooks, which may be problematic. So in some cases, you know, the old dialogic reading of the parent reading a print book is perceived as superior to reading an ebook. But this book will talk about understanding and creating digital text, examples there. And then the other one that's coming out later this month called Using Apps for Learning Across the Curriculum with David O'Brien has a lot more examples of using iOS or Android apps. This is also on the website. But yeah, how to keep up? It's a challenge. It's, you know, daily stuff coming out. I can't keep up. You know, I think the key is not getting overwhelmed, of choosing only a few apps or tools and really focusing on those few apps or tools in terms of getting students used to those, as opposed to getting overwhelmed by lots of different new apps coming out daily.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question from one of our participants who asks, as an English language arts person, how do you respond to a teacher who asks, isn't being able to read and understand good literature important anymore?
That's a great question. You know, the question is, what is literature now? I think certainly what's important is how can we better foster ways of responding to literature using these tools. Certainly the issue is the new ebook, the new hypertext. That's a new form of literature in terms of digital storytelling, which is much more multimodal. And I think if we can have students creating their own digital stories, they then appreciate that multimodality. But for me, the really important thing is how can we better foster critical response to literature in ways, for example, using those annotations as a discussion tool. And we've seen examples of the use of the annotation to
they really help focus attention on specific aspects of the text in terms of close reading. So by posting an annotation right at a certain line in a poem, that really serves to foster that focused reading. So it's really how do we use these tools to generate more richer discussions about these texts outside of class, inside of class, as well as using the online role play tools to foster dramatic inquiry, as represented in Brian Edmondson's new book on drama inquiry, where students can use these tools to engage in inquiry, critical inquiry through drama activities.
Thank you. We have another interesting question from one of our participants who asks, Dr. Beach, I completely agree that it is the activity the teacher plans that leads to whether or not something is dialogic. However, do you think there are inherent characteristics of some applications that would lead to more dialogic interaction between students without teacher interaction activities? I've had experiences that would lead me toward the idea that some applications promote dialogic interaction, while others tend to isolate students based on how it is created and what students need to do within the application. And this person was thinking specifically of iPad application directed toward young children.
Yeah, again, if you go to the link for our book on apps, there's a whole section on use of apps for reading. A lot of that is a little more focused on secondary level. But the question about dialogic interaction is people studying MOOC interactions now really focusing on the quality of those discussions and to what degree are those discussions dialogic. That is, are they really engaged with alternative critical perspectives in those online discussions? And in some cases that's not the case, but where teachers can create really engaging prompts or cases, and I would argue using cases here to generate these different competing perspectives, that is more likely to lead to dialogic interactions. As well as the use of some of the newer tools such as Subtext, which is an online discussion tool where you're focusing on discussion as a tool for discussions, where different students can access different reviewers and readers from all over the world about a certain text. And by reading those different perspectives, they engage in a more dialogic response because they have seen competing perspectives being reflected in those posts on a tool like Subtext.
Okay, thank you. One of several of our participants were interested in the idea of constraints of digital tools, and I know that your presentation is about the affordances, but are there any, have you ever encountered students who have had a negative impact on using digital tools?
Yeah, I think, for example, I think they might engage in online discussions that are problematic, where it's important to have certain etiquette rules or norms operating so they respect each other, they respond in a productive way. And so I think that actually requires some instruction or setting some ground rules for that kind of interaction. I've also seen students just, they're assigned to use a tool, and they may not like that tool. The teacher says, okay, we're going to use X tool, we're going to use this tool. I would say an alternative to that, and there's a nice example here of the iChoose program here at a local school district where the students themselves choose their own tools. So they're given a choice of, say, 7 or 8 very commonly used tools. They then first define the problem or issue they're dealing with. They define their objectives. They then select those tools that are most relevant to addressing that objective or problem, and they are making the choice of the tools that they're using. One example of that that's very popular now is called Flipgrid, where students can post little quick videos about a certain issue or text. That's very popular with students. But the fact that students are selecting their own tools gives them ownership over those tools, and they're a lot more likely to be engaged in critical inquiry because they are selecting the tool based on what they want to do in critical inquiry. So teachers need to give up their ownership. They need to realize these students have the ability to use tools to engage themselves and make those choices themselves. So turning things over to the students as co-learners or even co-teachers, I think really helps to motivate students, as in the case of the I Choose project, to be more engaged in use of these tools as being told, okay, use these tools. And sometimes that, like in any, read this book, any example of that can lead to student resistance.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you. We have an interesting question. Do students readily adopt a critical stance? I have seen many students using digital tools and social media to perpetuate stereotypes.
Great question. No, they don't. And I think this is where teachers really, and drawing on the 4 resources I talked about, and examples that can really have to create contexts or activities that would lead to critical inquiry. And I think we need to study that whole process. We need research on this because we can't just assume that students will adopt a critical inquiry stance. For example, right now I'm looking at a classroom where they're reading 1984, and the teacher is going to have them create their own, and this came out of Hilary Jank's book, create their own propaganda infographic as a way of understanding how propaganda works or how advertising works. There's a lot of students, and I would say there's a lot of propaganda out there online now or on television about climate change, the oil companies, the coal companies. There's a lot of propaganda out there. Or do they really challenge the ways in which advertising is used? We can't assume that they do, and they will. So creating that critical stance, but then through activity like creating an online propaganda image or text. It's through the activity itself where they're creating text, and that's what tools really allow students to do, that leads to that critical stance.
I'm going to ask one more question. Hopefully you'll be able to respond to it in short order. It says, what is the difference, or what is the importance of different modalities in understanding intertextual connections, especially in digital spaces? Should written text be primary, or visuals or other systems be equally important?
Well, I think we saw the example of the Ford Mustang example of recontextualizing, where it's meshing the image with language and with that voice-read tool, but it's that combining the different modalities that really leads to, and I think fosters, more critical inquiry than simply going along with just the image without the language, or the language or the writing without the image. Because I think in today's society, it's really the images and the video that are really a powerful text. And it's those images and videos that we really need to draw on, but then bring in other modalities around those images, as was the case with the Ford Mustang critique, to foster that kind of adoption of critical stances. Because that's where students are. They are with the images and the videos. We need to think about how we foster that adopting a stance against, speaking against the text, but also using the text for their own critical inquiry and action.
Thank you, Dr. Beach. That was wonderful. Now, that ends our Q&A, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderators.
Thank you, Dr. Beach. You certainly offered an intriguing and forward-thinking perspective on tonight's literacy conversation, and much to consider in the realm of literacy education. Thank you for this. Please remember to get Dr. Beach's latest book, Understanding and Creating Digital Text, which will be released next Wednesday on October 15th. And if you haven't had a chance to access Dr. Beach's handouts, please refer to the chat area for the link. Let's give Dr. Beach another virtual round of applause. We would appreciate you taking a moment to type into the chat area. Whoops. Something's happening, sorry. We would appreciate you taking a moment to type into the chat area one thought about this web seminar. Additionally, if you would be willing to participate in a 15 to 20-minute interview as part of a GCLR research study, please type your name and interview and an email address into the chat area, and someone from the research team will contact you very soon to schedule an interview. Also, please take a few minutes to take our survey. The link is on our website. Please schedule future web seminars into your calendar. We have outstanding literacy scholars who will present on a wide range of research. As you know, these are open access web seminars, so please share our project with others whom you think would be interested. Our next featured speaker is Dr. David Berliner on November 9th. Also join us for Dr. Barbara Conger on January 15th, Dr. Jackie Marsh on February 8th, Dr. Jim Cummins in March, and Dr. Raul Mora in April. On behalf of Dr. Beach, Dr. Alvers, Citation, and myself, Cindy Fujimoto, thank you all for sharing this hour with us. We truly appreciate your attendance, participation, and most importantly, your interest in these most important discussions about literacy. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening or day.
During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Beach will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you're participating in tonight's web seminar. Please use the star tool and click your location on the map. Thank you so much. Dr. Richard Beach is an internationally recognized scholar and speaker who has presented widely in the areas of reader response, particularly multicultural literature, digital writing, and use of literacy tools and critical inquiry. He's also a professor emeritus in English education at the University of Minnesota, USA. Dr. Beach is the author of over 20 books. His latest book, Understanding and Creating Digital Text, will be released next week on October 15th. Dr. Beach's web seminar will focus how affordances of digital tools, multimodality, collaboration, interactivity, intertextuality, recontextualization, and identity.
Having that stance leads to then students learning to disrupt the commonplace. They challenge the commonplace. Why are we having this? What's going on here in the status quo? They're learning to interrogate different multiple perspectives. They're focusing on the social-political issues of power, injustice, privilege that are central to critical inquiry. And they're taking action to promote social justice. And it's that taking action which is, I think, a really important part of how digital tools can really foster critical literacy. The second framework I'm drawing on is a book by Becky Rogers, Melissa Mosley, and Marion Kramer, and the Literacy for Social Justice Teacher Research Group in St. Louis called Designing Socially Just Learning Communities. And this is a wonderful book, too, related to on-the-ground action in terms of fostering a focus on equity, access, and outcomes. And in that book, as illustrated in this chart, you see a focus on action, advocacy, social change, building community, critical inquiry and analysis, and again, developing critical stances. So taking the stance becomes another important part of critical inquiry.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Global Conversation in Literacy with Dr. Richard Beach. It's nice to see returning GCLR participants, and we welcome those of you joining us for the first time. We hope you will continue to return to future presentations. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, Jihei Shin, Cindy Fujimoto, and members of the GCLR research team.
Global Conversations in Literacy Research consists of online interactive web seminars with the intent to circulate cutting-edge research in the field of literacy and language arts. GCLR currently seeks volunteers for a study on the nature of technology-mediated interactions within literacy-focused web seminars. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. Also, we invite all participants to take our GCLR survey. The hyperlink is on our website. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. Instructions serve to foster critical literacy. Dr. Beach will discuss how uses of digital tools are transforming instruction through supporting experiential and connected learning, as well as alternative learning spaces. At this time, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Beach and his presentation entitled, How Affordances of Digital Tool Use Foster Critical Literacy. Let's all give Dr. Beach a virtual round of applause using one of the emoticon symbols found in the drop box just below the moderator name.
Good evening, everybody. So glad you could join this wonderful seminar. I'm honored to be here. As I said, tonight I'm going to be talking about the topic of how affordances of digital tools are used to foster critical literacy. And it was indicated I have a handout on Google Docs at the URL indicated below. We've also put it in the chat room. That handout has a lot of links to resources, related readings, some apps that are relevant to these different tools, and I won't be talking a lot about specific apps, but there's a ton of them on there for your use. If you want to create a Word document off of the Google Docs, you can simply just download it off of Docs as a Word document. So tonight I'm going to be talking about critical literacy and critical inquiry, and I'm drawing on 4 different frameworks that I've found really useful. A lot of these are fairly recent. The first one is a new book by Mitzi Lewison, Chris Leland, and Jerry Harsty. And Jerry, I'm glad to see you're in the chat room, called Creating Critical Classrooms, Reading and Writing with an Edge. This is a wonderful book that has a lot of very specific classroom examples of teachers engaging in critical inquiry. And the focus of this book has a lot to do with what's on this chart, where teachers and students draw on their own personal and cultural resources. They then apply those in terms of using different critical practices. And to me, a key concept here is the whole idea of a critical stance. Because I think learning to adopt a critical stance is very important in terms of a critical literacy approach.